Well, it was a really heinous crime. This is a classic no-winners kind of story.
And it's called the last great train holdup.
In 20th century railroad robbery lore, this was certainly the most brutal. They went to dynamite the car, but they basically used every stick of dynamite they had.
Incinerated, literally incinerated the mail car and the mail clerk inside.
Even if the gold was on that train, they literally blew it up.
There's more to the story than just three brothers who decided to rob a train. It was a crime of the century at the time.
Funding for Oregon Experience is provided by Arlene Schnitzer and Jordan Schnitzer, the Robert D. and Marcia H. Randall Fund for Lifelong Learning, the Oregon Cultural Trust, the Clark Foundation, and viewers like you. Thank you.
In the spring of 1927, hundreds gathered at a southern Oregon train depot for the arrival of a notorious criminal.
There was an air of excitement. Everybody wanted to be involved. Everybody wanted to see what was happening.
After a 4-year manhunt that had stretched the globe, one of the infamous D'Entremont brothers was finally standing trial for murder.
This trial was one of the biggest things that Jacksonville had ever seen. It brought newsreel cameras and reporters from all over the place.
"23-year-old Hugh D'Entremont posed for photographs, made jokes, and waved to onlookers.
There was a lot of sympathy for Hugh. His 2 older brothers were still at large, and here's this young-looking guy supposedly masterminding the whole thing. It just wasn't believable.
But many people, especially in the railroad communities, called for the gallows.
The D'Entremonts were in no way heroic young robbers to them. They were just cold-blooded murderers.
According to their own confessions, on October 11, 1923, Hugh, Ray, and Roy D'Entremont held up a Southern Pacific train as it made its way through the Siskiyou Mountains of southern Oregon. It resulted in tragedy. 4 men killed, a deadly explosion, lives forever ruined. The newspapers called it the Siskiyou outrage.
Well, it's heinous. This is a classic no-winners kind of story. Nobody went into this and came out improved in any way at all.
Way out west in Oregon in 1923, the D'Entremont brothers wrecked the train as brutal as could be.
The holdup and murders have become the basis of countless stories, showing up in comic books, trading cards, and movies.
But it just captured the imagination. Back in the 20s, people still thought this was the Old West.
It was a crime of the century at the time. And it had a lot of alluring little coincidence because it was train number 13 going through tunnel 13.
Nearly a century later, people still leave wreaths at the site, and questions remain.
I think that's a lot of the appeal of this story, is that a lot of it just doesn't make sense. You kind of feel like there's a piece missing someplace. Why and how?
Train robberies have long been part of popular culture. In 1903, audiences flocked to The Great Train Robbery, considered the first blockbuster movie. Dime novels portrayed Jesse James, Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, and others as daring adventurers or even heroes.
The Robin Hood idea of people who flaunt the law, who are maybe from the lower rungs of society, and do something on a grand scale that attracts the attention and even the approval of many people.
For the D'Outremont brothers, the story sparked fantasies of a better life.
I was pretty well soaked full of those crime stories, like Jesse James and others. But it helped contributing factor.
Twins Ray and Roy D'Outremont were born in Williamsburg, Ohio in 1900, followed 4 years later by brother Hugh. Their parents, Belle and Paul, would have 5 boys.
The family moved a lot. Paul was always trying to find an opportunity that was better than the last.
Paul left the family and started a new life in Oregon, while Belle was left to raise the boys alone.
This is a pre-safety net world. So if you didn't work, you didn't eat.
You had families, Mom can't afford me and my brother anymore, so we're just going to hop a freight and hopefully we can find some work and then maybe send some money back and help them at home, and that was quite prevalent.
At just 16 years old, Ray left home. Roy soon followed. They illegally rode trains across the country in search of work.
You would try to get it at the slowest, safest speed possible and just run alongside and grab, and there you go. There's some of the movies, they show these people running alongside, and all of a sudden they grab it and they lift themselves in there. Well, not in the real world. I mean, you're going to kill yourself.
Ray and Roy joined their father in Oregon. Roy got a job at the State Mental Asylum in Salem. Ray worked at the Vancouver shipyards, and at 18 years old became a card-carrying member of the International Workers of the World, known as the IWW, or Wobblies, a decision that would forever change his life.
There is power in the band of working men when they stand hand in hand, that's a power.
Well, the IWW, they were very popular with lowly paid, itinerant young male workers. Ray was, for a while, quite taken with the dogmas, the preachings of the IWW.
In 1919, violence broke out between the American Legion and the IWW in Centralia, Washington. Several legionnaires ended up dead. Police arrested IWW organizer Wesley Everett from Newburgh. A mob broke into the jail and lynched him.
And then after that, basically it was illegal to be a wob in Washington.
Police arrested Ray and thousands of other IWW members under the controversial new charge of criminal syndicalism. After a failed escape attempt, he was sentenced to a year in jail.
Ray came out of the reformatory embittered against the world. His mind was saturated with hatred. Hugh D'Outremont, 1927.
After getting out of jail, Ray went to work in the woods, but the jobs never lasted long.
He felt that the world owed them a living.
He grew more and more bitter, more determined to find ways to do whatever it took to make money and to share it with his family.
The now 23-year-old twins formed a plan with their 19-year-old brother Hugh.
They claimed they felt betrayed by the system and decided, well, why not? We'll rob a train and then we'll be on Easy Street. So they did.
Somewhere they picked up information saying there was going to be a big gold ship and this gold was going to go to San Francisco.
Later, the press would call the train the Gold Special.
It's the stuff of legend. It's a great name, but there's no reason why this train should be called the Gold Special.
Ray later told police he scouted tracks up and down the West Coast and decided to rob the train as it entered Tunnel 13 at the Siskiyou Summit.
The Siskiyous is the steepest grade A railroad line in the country. It required a large amount of tunnels, including the big tunnel 13.
Nearly 3,000 Chinese laborers dug and blasted their way through the mountain to build Tunnel 13. With its completion in 1887, a continuous rail line finally connected the West Coast. At its height, 8 passenger trains a day traveled the line.
The railroad promoted the Siskiyou line as part of its Road of 1,000 Wonders. As long as that Siskiyou line was run, it was a major draw for selling tickets for travelers to go north and south on the Pacific coast.
The railroad brought thousands of people to the far west, and new towns built up around the rail lines.
Ashland in 1923 was a very exciting place to be when the train came in, and anyone that had nothing else to do would walk down the train station to see it.
In the mountains outside of Ashland, near the Siskiyou Summit, the brothers hunkered down in an abandoned cabin. There, they prepared for the robbery, following the pattern established by the famous outlaws they idolized.
One would wait until a train was departing from a station, and so it was moving slowly. You'd climb the ladder and then walk across the top of the tender, and then you could drop down into the cab of the locomotive. That was absolutely standard methodology. And then you had to decide what you were going to do next.
Mail cars were popular targets. The railroads carried U.S. mail across the country, including payrolls, cash, and sometimes even gold. Mail clerks were armed, but usually there was only one on a train. A robber would use dynamite to blow open the locked mail car door, disarm the mail clerk, and get away with the goods.
People had realized that with a little bit of planning, you could carry off a robbery pretty easily.
In Oregon, there were minor and major train robberies all over the state, including a few shootouts with infamous criminals.
There were quite a few train robberies in the 1910s and even early 1920s, but the people who were doing them were getting caught.
The D'Entremonts planned to rob the Southern Pacific Train number 13 traveling south from Portland to San Francisco.
Ray had positioned himself at the west end of the tunnel, and he had their supplies. Hugh and Roy hiked over the hill to the north end of the tunnel, and they waited for the train.
Just north of the tiny Siskiyou station, near the summit, the train slowed to check its brakes. That's where Hugh and Roy jumped aboard, made their way to the engineer, and demanded he stop the train inside the tunnel. From there, they planned to blow up the locked mail car door.
They basically used every stick of dynamite they had, destroyed the car, and incinerated the mail clerk. So there was no mail, there was just ruin.
Railway Postal Clerk Elvin Doherty died instantly.
It was a whole new crime now. There was no going back. So they decided between themselves that they would take no prisoners.
They shot engineer Sidney Bates, fireman Marvin Singh, and brakeman Coyle Johnson. Through it all, in the dark, smoky tunnel, the engine's warning bell rang out.
At this point, people back in the train realized that something was horribly wrong.
There was a terrific explosion and the sound of crashing glass that was frightening. We didn't know until hours later that there had been an attempted holdup. Mary Hunter, passenger.
With 4 men now dead and the mail car destroyed, the brothers fled the scene, apparently empty-handed.
There would have been tremendous concussion, breakage of glass, and then a lot of fumes and things, and a lot of confusion.
Within hours, a search began for the culprits. The National Guard arrived, bloodhounds were brought in, and vigilante groups combed the mountain.
There were posses everywhere, airplanes flying overhead looking for the diatraments. Every law officer anywhere in the Pacific Northwest was being contacted by people who felt they had something to offer the manhunt.
Later, the brothers would say, they hid out in a secret cache under a fallen tree for over 2 weeks. Forensic scientist Ed Espinosa questions the official story.
This would have been 3 weeks in October going into November. I live in Southern Oregon. That's not true. You would freeze to death.
It does seem weird that the bloodhounds wouldn't be able to find them, that this huge manhunt is going around their ears.
And the first people on the scene reported seeing a suspicious car parked and later driving away from the tracks.
There were 4 men, possibly 5 in it. I particularly noticed that 3 men in the back seat were slouched down. Ashland Police Chief George McNabb.
If I had to propose an alternate hypothesis, is that they were taken out in that car.
While the diatromats were long gone, clues remained. They left behind overalls, a gun, a detonator, and more. With no real leads, investigators shipped the evidence to University of Berkeley chemist Edward Heinrich, renowned for using science to solve crime.
All of American forensics go back to him. Nobody was systematically collecting the evidence, analyzing the evidence, and interpreting the evidence, which really is what forensic science does today, and he was the first one to do that.
Heinrich became known as the Edison of crime detection and was compared to Sherlock Holmes. Within days of receiving the holdup evidence, he had an amazingly accurate report.
His report today would be a model of good science, and he did a really fantastic job describing the pieces of evidence, so it was very impressive.
From microscopic examination, chemical analysis, and a study of this garment, I am of the opinion that the wearer was a lumberjack employed in a fir or spruce logging camp. A white man, not over 165 pounds, probably less, aged between 21 and 25, neat in appearance, has medium light brown hair, complexion fair, with small hands and feet. Edward Heinrich, 1923.
Investigators were stunned. Heinrich also found evidence that hinted at illegal alcohol production. But that wasn't all.
The real smoking gun that identified the boys was these coveralls. Deep in a pencil pocket, there had been crammed some kind of piece of paper that was a postal receipt from Roy Diatrament sending money back home to his family in New Mexico.
The investigation wasn't about who should we be looking for, it was where do we find the diatraments.
Heinrich's work on the case became famous and prompted the founding of the nation's first crime lab in Los Angeles just months later.
The diatrament case was able to show law enforcement how useful scientific evaluation of the evidence could help them. It was very valuable, and we do all of that today, just slightly different, but we follow the same methodology.
Armed with names, photos, and even handwriting samples, investigators from several agencies launched the largest manhunt of the time.
2.5 million posters distributed around the world, $500,000 spent on the investigation, which was big money then. A lot of effort went into tracking them. Everybody wanted these people captured and hung at any expense.
In 1927, 4 years after the holdup, a wanted poster led to Hugh, half a world away. He had joined the Army under the name James Price and was stationed in the Philippines.
His commanding officer recognized, that's Private Price, contacted the authorities and said, I think one of the guys in my unit is Hugh d'Outremont.
Hugh was sent back to Jacksonville to stand trial. There, Mary Kelly was a young reporter covering the story.
She was ambitious. She wanted to be a reporter. Mom had even hopped aboard the train that Hugh's mother was coming on for the trial to get a personal profile and get to know her.
That began a lifelong friendship.
So you could say she lost her objectivity.
The press descended on the town for Hugh's trial.
When they selected a jury on May 2nd, there were 500 candidates for the jury. People were fighting to get into the court so that they could grab a seat and watch this whole thing.
There was sympathy for Hugh, and with only circumstantial evidence, the trial seemed to be going in his favor until a juror got sick and died.
By the time the judge had declared a mistrial, it was late in May, the weather was hot, the courtroom was hot, people were very impatient.
Then the twins were captured. They had been working as laborers in Steubenville, Ohio, living under the names Elmer and Clarence Goodwin.
Ray, or Elmer now, went to a dentist and convinced the dentist that he had to pull out a bad tooth. Well, this changed his appearance. He bleached his hair white.
Ray also married a local girl, 16-year-old Hazel. They had a baby, Jackie Hugh. When Ray was captured, she was pregnant again with a son she would name Ray Jr. They would remain married for 25 years.
Hazel, very naive. She wasn't sure what she would do or what was going to happen, but she was sure it would work out okay.
On June 21, 1927, Hugh was found guilty of murder. He and the twins agreed to confess as part of a plea agreement to avoid the death penalty. They were sentenced to life at the Oregon State Penitentiary.
One thing, they were stupid. The man who pulled the trigger said it was all for nothing.
Well, robbing a train was just a terrible idea.
It was an absolute failure. It was a tragedy and a failure.
A legend circulated that every time a train passed the prison, it would blow its horn in memory of the murdered railroad men.
Well, the railroad community was unforgiving. 30 or 40 years later, the railroad community was opposing any kind of reprieve or release for the d'Outremont brothers from prison.
While the d'Outremonts became legendary, the victims were largely forgotten.
There's stories in town of the widow of the engineer who was doing laundry for people because she had no income, they had children.
And it's really the family who were the victims. Those who were killed, they were gone, they were out of the picture. But the family, for years, grieved and suffered from their losses.
The d'Outremonts would spend most of their lives in prison. Hugh became a printer, working on the prison newspaper, and he remained friends with reporter Mary Kelly.
And Mom was writing letters to people, trying to get public sympathy for Hugh to get out early, at least.
In 1958, Mary's daughter Noreen worked to get him paroled.
I had just gotten out of law school.
It turned out to be complicated. There were still pending federal indictments on top of the earlier murder charges, meaning the case could be tried all over again.
And I was having nightmares at night, and I would see them building a gallows because death was by hanging in 1923 when the crimes were committed. Well, that wasn't a very pleasant thought.
But she prevailed. In 1958, after 31 years in jail, Hugh won his release. He had a fiancée, a job as a printer, and the hope of a new life.
But of course, by the time they let him go, he had the cancer.
Hugh died 2 months later. Over time, Roy began to grow violent. He was given a frontal lobotomy and spent the rest of his life in the state asylum where he had once worked. He eventually died in a nursing home. In 1961, Ray D'Atremont was released on parole. He got a job as a custodian at the University of Oregon and spent his time painting.
Ray became a scholar. He did a lot of reading. He learned languages, other subjects, taught them to inmates, and became arguably a contributory citizen.
How do you do, Mr. Governor? I'm very happy at this opportunity to meet you.
And in 1972, Governor Tom McCall commuted Ray's sentence.
You're an ideal example that reformation can work. It was easy, and I was proud and happy to have the opportunity to do it.
On the 50th anniversary of the crime, Ray returned to Tunnel 13.
Everything we had was invested in the crime. We probably didn't have $3 among us. And we weren't thinking about going back to those logging camps, to that hard labor. Probably, no doubt, it would have been a good idea if we had.
In 1984, Ray died at the age of 84. Through the years, it's been called the last great American train robbery, but it wasn't.
It drives me to distraction. First off, I think anything that kills people can't be called great by any stretch of the imagination. It was not a robbery because nothing was stolen, nothing was taken. It was a holdup. And it also was not the last crime of its kind.
There was a far larger one that took place in Illinois the following year. One, in fact, that involved a post office car with 17 clerks aboard was robbed of several $1 million.
By almost all accounts, including their own confessions, the D'Atremont brothers got nothing from their attempted train robbery, and there was no direct evidence that anything was stolen. But still, for years, some questioned the official story.
At the time, there was a rumor that the train carried a shipment of gold, a report the government has never fully denied nor confirmed. Charles Osborne, former editor, Ashland Tidings.
Did the train really carry gold or a large cash payroll? Was there a link to bootlegging or organized crime? For some, the full story behind the holdup of Train 13 remains a mystery.
If I had to postulate, these three brothers were set up to do this for some reason, and something was taken. And what that is, we'll never know.
There's more about murder on the Southern Pacific on Oregon Experience Online. To learn more or to order a DVD of the show, visit opb.org.
My man's a jolly railroad man, his engine's number 11. If you want a better man, you'll have to go to heaven. For anything he undertakes is always on the square. The only thing he asks of you, be sure and pay your fare.
Funding for Oregon Experience is provided by Arlene Schnitzer and Jordan Schnitzer, the Robert D. and Marcia H. Randall Fund for Lifelong Learning, the Oregon Cultural Trust, the Clark Foundation, and viewers like you. Thank you.